Apple has finally given us 16GB RAM base model Macs, something we've been begging them to do for close to a decade. The question is though, why? Well, long story short, they kind of had to. Let me explain. AI is one of the top reasons, right? Come on, you think the Terminator only had 8GB of RAM in his head the entire time he was hunting Sarah Connor? Hell no, he paid $200 for the 16GB RAM upgrade. Duh. All jokes aside, AI is actually surprisingly demanding. I mean, Apple's version of AI, which is Apple Intelligence, is made up of different types of AI. One type is large language models, or LLMs. Now, you'll see this in action when using Apple's writing tools feature, where it can proofread, summarize, and organize, or even write for you using your previous content and tone prompts. For quick text messages or a small email chain, for example, it's no problem. But proofreading a 30-page essay or writing a detailed email reply using an entire 6-month email chain as context, including images and attachments, well, that's a little harder. The AI has to crunch all of that data and then apply certain protocols to it to spit out a result, which is what you're actually going to see on the screen. This is of course the same with generative AI, right? Where you can create custom images or even edit existing photos. It can be really demanding. In fact, there are rumors that Microsoft plans to increase the minimum RAM requirements for its upcoming Windows 12 operating system to 16GB. And this is to run its version of Apple Intelligence, known as Copilot, at minimum efficiency. That's right, minimum efficiency. So if Apple had kept that 8GB RAM base model, once you subtract the RAM that the actual macOS operating system itself needs to run, which is about 3GB, you've realistically got about 4 to 5GB left to run all of your apps and Apple Intelligence. And we've already seen how Apple Intelligence runs on the brand new M4 iPad chips with only 8GB of RAM. It is just not good in some situations. And let's not forget that AI in general, in this case Apple Intelligence, is still in the very, very early stages. It's likely going to get even more demanding very quickly. And Apple wants this whole process to be quick and snappy and done locally on your device rather than going off to some data center or the cloud to be crunched and then sent back to you. Now, while this whole move to 16GB of RAM may be due mainly to Apple Intelligence, there are a few secondary benefits. I mean, competition is a great thing when it comes to consumer technology, right? But the problem is, at least for us consumers, Apple hasn't really had any major competition for their ARM Apple Silicon chips since 2020. That changed this year though, because we've gotten a bunch of ARM-based chips from some huge players, AMD, Qualcomm, and obviously Intel, and those chips are actually really good. And one of the main marketing / selling points of Windows laptops is they almost always come with double the amount of RAM as the competing Apple MacBooks. Let's take the previous M3 MacBook Pro as an example. If I look at one of the most popular MacBook competitors from the Windows side, which is the Dell XPS 14, with Intel's new Core Ultra 7 chip, it's not only a few $100 cheaper than the M3 MacBook Pro, but also obviously gets 16GB of RAM. Of course, now that Apple has updated the M4 MacBooks with 16GB of RAM, the comparison and price point is much more equal. And that's the same with most of the other competing laptops featuring AMD or Qualcomm chips. Also, if you check out the older M3 and M2 MacBook Airs that Apple is still selling on their website, they've magically been updated to 16GB of RAM at no extra cost. So it looks like that 8GB RAM base model is completely gone now. Of course, it still has a tiny little piddly 256GB base model SSD versus the 512GB or sometimes even 1TB for competitors, but that stings a little less than only 8GB of RAM, at least in my own personal opinion. Now, ditching 8GB for 16GB is also going to make Apple's entire product pipeline simpler and more efficient. I mean, just think about it for a second. Like, everything from manufacturing to marketing is now easier. For example, you don't have to manufacture both 8GB and 16GB RAM Macs, or have different stickers on product boxes or stock both configurations in stores. And that stock is also easier to count and keep track of, among other things. I also think simpler upgrade options for customers is a good sales strategy. I mean, Apple Silicon Macs in particular just seem to be following the Dell strategy of having almost unlimited configuration options. Should I upgrade the RAM or maybe the SSD, or use that money for extra CPU cores, or maybe just get the Pro version because it already comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM, etc. You guys know the drill. I used to work in marketing, and you'd be surprised at just how much analysis paralysis will impact a consumer's purchase decision. Sometimes they'll be so confused or unsure, they just won't buy it or will stick with their current machine for a few more years. Which is good for the environment, don't get me wrong, but for Apple's bottom line, it's not so good. Now, starting the RAM at 16 gigabytes not only makes this process simpler and eliminates some of that analysis paralysis, but it also pushes people towards upgrading other things, right? Like a non-binned chip or extra storage, for example. So basically, lots of people are still going to give Apple that extra $200, it just won't be for the RAM. Side note, you can still pay for that extra $200 RAM upgrade, but it'll just add an additional 8 gigabytes onto the existing 16 gigabytes, giving you 24 gigabytes of RAM in total. Not bad, and if you want to see how much RAM you actually need, you can check this video out where I cover that in a little bit more detail.